So this lecture talks about the skeletal system, and this is a list of the learning objectives that we'll cover in this week's lecture. As you can see, there are quite a few, so this is going to be a pretty big lecture this week. So to begin, we're just going to start with an introduction to the skeletal system. What are some of the functions of bone? Well, support, protection, movement. Those are probably the more obvious functions. So it supports our frame, it protects internal organs, and it allows us to move. So it serves as like levers that the muscles can move in order to allow us to move our bodies. But then the not so obvious ones include mineral storage and hematopoiesis. Mineral storage is huge, and the minerals that we predominantly store in the bone are going to be calcium and phosphorus. Calcium has so many essential roles in the body, and we'll learn about some of those roles as we go through here. Another major function of the bone is hematopoiesis. And hematopoiesis is the production of blood cells. This is both red blood cells and white blood cells, and this happens in the bone marrow. We can classify bones based on their shape. Long bones are long, which kind of seems a little bit obvious, but they're longer than they are wide. So an example of a long bone includes the humerus here, the femur in the upper leg, the tibia and fibula in the lower leg, the radius and ulna of the lower arm. Short bones are short, you guessed it. So short bones you can find in the ankle and in the wrist. So here's a short bone that's a carpal bone. Flat bones, again, like you guessed, are flat. So flat bones are flat, and an example is the sternum, and then several bones of the skull constitute flat bones. Irregular bones have a different shape that can't easily be described by one of these other terms. So an example of an irregular bone would be the vertebrae. An sesamoid bone is a seed-like bone, or seed-like in nature. It's usually anchored within a tendon or within a ligament of some sort. An example of a sesamoid bone includes the patella, the kneecap. And then there's also sesamoid bones that you find in the thumb. When we take a cross-section of a bone, we can see various tissues inside of the bone. The region that's more dense is known as compact bone, while the region that looks light in nature and porous in nature is called spongy bone. Compact bone, also called cancellous bone, is dense, and you're going to find that in the outer edges of flat bones and many other bones, and then in the shaft of long bones. Spongy bone, also known as trabecular bone, is located at the ends of long bones and then in the centers of many other bones. The reason why we call this trabecular bone is because all of these ridges that make up the solid portion of the bone in here is called trabeculae. So some of the parts of a long bone. First, the epiphyses. When we say epiphysis, IS, we're talking about one of the ends. But together, the epiphyses with an ES is talking about both ends. So the epiphysis or epiphyses are talking about the ends of the long bone. In the epiphysis, you're going to find the epiphyseal line. And here you can see it. And that's the line that used to be a growth plate. So up until the point where you stop growing, it's known as the epiphyseal plate. And it's filled with cartilage. When you stop growing taller, then this epiphyseal plate gets converted from cartilage to bone, and then it's referred to as the epiphyseal line, which is really the remnant of the growth plate. The spongy bone you'd find at the ends of the long bone, and the compact bone you'd find in the shaft of the long bone. And another word for the shaft is the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is the shaft of the long bone. In the center of the diaphysis, you're going to find the medullary cavity, and the medullary cavity contains bone marrow. Here you can see a picture. There's the periosteum. The periosteum, peri means to surround something. Osteum is referring to the bones. So the periosteum is a connective tissue that surrounds the outside of the bone. The endosteum, endo, is talking about inside of or from within. The endosteum is connective tissue that lines the internal cavities of the bone. The endosteum kind of supports everything on the inside, while the periosteum allows blood vessels to move up to the bone. If you didn't have this periosteum that cushions and supports the blood vessel entry into the bone, every time that you would contract your muscle, these blood vessels would rupture. We don't want that to happen, obviously, so we have this periosteum. And the periosteum has these spider web-like projections that allow it to stick to the outside surface of the bone. And those are known as Sharpie's fibers. So now we go on to the different types of marrow. There's red marrow and there's yellow marrow. Red marrow is going to be mostly responsible for hematopoiesis. Or blood cell production. In infants, you're going to find red marrow in the center of long bones. While in adults, you're going to find it in spongy bone. Yellow marrow is really responsible for just fat storage. In infants, it's not very common because infants have a lot of fat stores all over their body. But in adults, it's found in the center of long bones. Or the medullary cavities. So a little bit more about this bone marrow and bone marrow transplants. When somebody wants to get a bone marrow transplant, it's usually not something that you want to do or want to have to go through, but if you need it in order to save your life. What you want to transplant is the red marrow, not the yellow marrow. Nobody needs a fat transplant. Well, at least for the most part, we don't need a fat transplant. We need the hematopoietic stem cells, those cells that are going to be able to generate red blood cells and white blood cells. And sometimes this is to replace defective types of cells. If you put fresh stem cells that are not defective in the bone marrow of a patient, then they can start to grow normally functioning blood cells, in addition to the defective ones that are incorporated in their genome. And this helps save lives, and it helps treat different types of cancers, like leukemias and such. So we want to donate and get or receive this hematopoietic stem cell compilation in the red marrow. Infants, we don't want to use those as donors. So usually we look for adults to be donors. And in adults, the location that you're going to find it is in the spongy bone. Where we commonly obtain the red marrow for a transplant would be in the spongy bone that's found at the end of the femur or in the pelvis, sometimes the scapula or the vertebrae. So now that we've gone through the different structures that you can see here, We've got the spongy bone, we've got the remnant of the growth plate here, known as the epiphyseal line. We've got this medullary cavity that contains marrow. If we were to take a cross-section of this diaphysis and blow it up to look at the different components of the tissue here, of this compact bone, we can see all of these units. And incorporated within those units are called osteocytes. So osteocytes are the bone cells that are embedded within mature and adult bone. In addition to the osteocytes that you would find incorporated into the bone matrix, and those are the mature bone cells, we have osteoblasts, which are kind of the baby bone cells because they're most abundant in babies as babies are initially developing their skeleton. And then they're going to be responsible for bone growth and bone deposit for the remainder of that person's life. Osteogenic cells are stem cells that can become any one of these other cell types. And an osteoclast is a bone resorbing cell. What it means to resorb means to secrete out digestive enzymes in order to break down the bone tissue, and then you can absorb those nutrients and transcytose or transport them into the bloodstream. So if the bone was here, this thing that kind of looks like a character from Ghostbusters is going to stick to the surface of the bone. It's going to release digestive enzymes to release the calcium, phosphorus, and amino acids and protein matrix that's all stored inside of the bone. And then all of those nutrients are going to go across this cell and into the bloodstream. So osteoclasts destroy bone, while osteoblasts and osteocytes are going to help build bone. Osteoblasts do a majority of bone growth and new bone deposit, while osteocytes are trapped inside of existing bones, so they only do minor modifications to increase the size of the bone. So if we look at this again, it's a cross-section of a bone, a long bone. Here we have the medullary cavity in the center, and then circulating around in this compact bone region are these circular units. And here you can see one of the circular units, and here's another circular unit. These circular units are called osteons. So an osteon is a functional unit of bone, and it's made up of a few parts. The lamellae are the rings, which, if you remember from the tissues lecture, it kind of looks like rings from a tree. The central canals go through the center of each osteon, and they contain blood vessels and a nerve supply. The lacunae are the cavities that contain the osteocytes. And the canaliculi are tiny tunnels that allow for nutrients to get from the central canal to each one of the osteocytes. So here you can see the picture a little bit better. So if we look at the cross section here, we're looking at this region. And when we blow this up, you can see the medullary cavity, and this is where you're going to have bone marrow. And then surrounding the medullary cavity, you have all of these osteons, these functional units of bone. And you can see them. Here's one, here's an osteon, and so forth. So you can see those all the way around the bone. And if we look inside of what an osteon is made up of, we see the rings. So here's a ring, here's a ring, here's a ring. Those rings are known as the lamellae. At the center of each one, you have blood vessels and nerves that run into the central canal. And you can see that this is actually a complex system. So there's Volkmann's canals that allow these to go perpendicular to the bone, and then the central canal goes parallel to the bone. If we blow this up even more, now you can start to see the cavities that the osteocytes are stored in. And those cavities are called lacunae. So here you can see an osteocyte that's trapped inside the bone and it's stored inside of this cavity. And then all these tiny tunnels, these cracks in the bone that allow for nutrients to get from the central canal to each one of these osteocytes is known as the canaliculi. Think of tiny canals or tiny tunnels for nutrients to get from the central canal to all of these osteocytes. Bone is living tissue. So because bone is living tissue, all of these osteocytes need nutrients. And for that reason, we have to have a blood supply going through the bone.